like to speak about intrusion, mental intrusion. When you have an intrusive thought, doesn't necessarily need to be directly connected with an external stimulus, but sometimes it is. Intrusion, I think, is connected with the idea of repression. I don't really think we can conceive of a thought or event as intrusive unless we also have the desire to repress that thought or event. Let's say you're angry at somebody and you feel this anger well up in you. That could be an intrusive anger. You might want to try to repress it. You might succeed or you might not. You see someone who's attractive, and for whatever reason, you can't allow yourself to pursue that for whatever sociological reason. So you try to repress that. Those thoughts then we qualify as intrusive. We give them that qualifier. We attach that quality to them because we are trying to engage in the act, the verbiage of repression against those thoughts. So intrusivity we conceive of in certain ways as I guess it is intruding. There's an action oriented nature to the quality of intrusion, that we imagine that the thought or the event has itself a will, that it is pushing itself into our temenos, our sacred space, our mind space. We want control over ourselves, and this thought then intrudes in. From maybe a Buddhist perspective, there really is no such thing as an intrusive event, and intrusive thoughts are not repressed, but they're simply not allowed to have any effect, or they're simply allowed to pass in through the perception, unmodified, unscrutinized, unanalyzed, simply to pass in and pass out, into the consciousness, out of the memory. There it is, there it goes. So I think that when we think about the way that animals think, the way that animals perceive, the way that animals live and act, most wild animals, I don't think, really have intrusivity, and they don't really have repression. They simply have their instincts, they have their impulses, they have fear, and so they run away, and they have attraction, and so they lurch towards something. They have these instincts and they follow their instincts. They're in a natural state. They're in a state of simply being who they are. They are not trying to repress anything, and they're not viewing anything as intrusive. When you start to domesticate animals, it's interesting that you get, for example, the dog who wants to eat the treat but knows he has to stay sitting in order to get the treat. And so the thought, if dogs do have thoughts, the thought of getting the treat is sort of an intrusive thought. The dog is trying to repress that to be a good dog, to stay seated, so that ultimately in the long term he can get the treat, because he knows if he starts moving around, then the owner is going to take away the treat. So the dog sort of squirms, and you can see that the dog is making these subtle movements, maybe whining. The dog looks visibly uncomfortable. So the emotion of being uncomfortable and the practice of trying to mentally suppress what comes naturally to us, what our instincts are, using learned behavior, using essentially what is memetics. That is a structure which is not genetic in origin, but ultimately all learning, you could say, arises out of genetics in some way. But in any case, it's learned behavior. The dog has learned through empirical experience. He's going to get the treat if he stays seated. And so there's a conflict between his memetic structures, his genetic structures, and that creates this discomfort, that creates this stress, that creates negativity, that creates repression. And so, someone who has a natural instinct to eat food, and they just eat as much as they want, and they feel no guilt and no shame, that person's going to be a lot happier, and that person, at least in the short term, and that person is not going to waste their energy repressing that instinct to eat whatever food they want. And so they're maybe going to live a more productive life. On the other hand, someone who is constantly neurotic, and we see this out of religious traditions where people who have a lot of rules, they tend to become neurotic. They're like a squirming dog all the time. They don't know how to be in a free flow. They don't know how to relax. They don't know how to be comfortable. They don't have any charisma because, of course, charisma is really something that's more genetic than mimetic. I mean, you can learn certain forms of charisma and social signaling, but charisma is very intuitive. Charisma is not something you gain through analysis and through careful Machiavellian, say the right word at the right time. Charisma, I mean, there might be multiple levels to charisma, but I think there's an underlying foundation or base which is very instinctual, which is very quick reaction time, fast reflex. You don't really have time to analyze this situation. And people who are very neurotic, people who are paralyzed by analysis, they can't access the charisma because there's this wall of analysis that's standing before them and their instincts. They can't even get in touch with their instincts. And in some cases, that might be because their instincts are so maladaptive for the current ecology that they find themselves situated in that they develop a lifelong habit of being anti-instinctual. So, as an example, let's say you have a child who, anytime he shows any sort of emotion, laughing, playfulness, rambunctiousness, energy, anytime he raises his voice, anytime he runs through the house, anytime he it makes a joke or whatever, anytime he shows this kind of positivity, his parent or parents view this as a weakness and they're annoyed by it. And maybe the parent is a sadist and maybe not physically abusive, but emotionally abusive. And every time the child sort of perks up and feels happy and feels free and feels relaxed, the parent gets sort of jealous and the parent lashes out in a sadistic way, and the parent basically talks down to the child and finds some way to lower the child's self-esteem and say, oh, what are you happy about? You're an idiot. And you don't know anything, and shut up. And, basically there are many different ways to do this. And it's very easy to hurt children's self-esteem children are very receptive. We think of children as rebellious and independent, but they're very receptive. They're like sponges. And so if you punish them like a dog, if you punish a dog for a certain behavior, the dog's going to avoid that behavior. Even if we as human beings like to think that we have this analysis that allows us to recognize the rationality or irrationality of our actions and to adjust our behavior accordingly, that's not actually entirely possible. And so as a result, we have a situation where someone can grow up in this kind of neurotic environment where anytime they do anything positive, they're shot down. And so as a result, they basically create a wall of analysis, this constant wall of analysis to protect them, to put themselves, to put in between themselves and whoever is attacking them. It's a defensive wall, and it allows them to not show any, laughter or giddiness or playfulness or any kind of rule-breaking behavior. So they're constantly focused at all times on this analytical perspective, and that sort of creates this numbing shield that blocks out access to charisma, and everything is from a third-person perspective. They can't live in the moment. They're always analyzing the past and the future. And that is adaptive to the environment that we're talking about, that prevents them from feeling the pain of feeling happy and then being shot down. And this, I think, can also have a genetic basis. I think that if you have a population of people who, have a religion or they have some cultural practice that encourages this kind of behavior for whatever reason, then you're ultimately going to ingrain that in the population to the point where this phenomenon is almost independent of whatever specific home situation we're talking about. It becomes generalized, it becomes intergenerational. So it's an interesting phenomenon to look at. The hippie who does drugs because he feels like it. He's surfing all day. He's, sleeping with multiple women. He might steal for food. He doesn't have a job. He's happy to steal. He's happy to commit crime. But he's also happy to be charitable and share, homeless people. They love to share the food, share what they have. They're not really, as I would generalize them, they're not very selfish people. you would think someone who doesn't have a lot would be even more covetous of it, but often it's the richest people who are the most covetous, because that's how you become rich, is you covet. And so through your covetousness, you are able to acquire wealth, whereas the people who just share everything and they don't care and they're not attached to those things, and they have a short time preference as opposed to a long time preference, they're like, yeah, let's share everything. So there's that hippie mindset, which is very charismatic in a way, and very attractive in a way, even though we can see it has self-destructive tendencies, or tendencies that are, you can't really build a civilization on a kind of polyamorous, tribal, nomadic, wandering, devil may care attitude. But there is something attractive about that, as opposed to the neurotic type, who can build civilization through, Freud talks about this repression as the origin of civilization. The neurotic type can build a civilization. He can use his analysis to solve all sorts of problems, read all kinds of books, gain all kinds of knowledge, figure out every situation, dissect it, using science, right? Science means to cut apart. Scienza is where we get scissors, or schism. So he's cutting apart everything, he's dissecting everything. But in doing so, he loses the soul of life. In traditional human burial, the body is to be not just buried whole, but also to be adorned with gifts and material goods that could be pragmatically used by other members of the tribe, or sold in exchange for something or other, and the money used to promote the survival of the descendants. I mean, there's so many different pragmatic considerations, but they would bury these, especially nobility. You look at ancient burial sites, they would bury them with crowns and jewelry and swords and even food and all kinds of things. You can say, oh, well, that was a superstitious belief that they would need those things in the other life, like the Egyptians believed you would actually need your organs, so they meticulously jarred them up, and all of these things. You can say, oh, well, they really believed that would be helpful to the person, and it was a pragmatic thing. It was just a very superstitious pragmatism. But I think there is a kind of honoring of the individual through the holism of, whatever pragmatic considerations there may be. We have to respect the whole person, the integrated personality, the person as he was, and not dissect him. And so I think the dissection of bodies, which you see with ancient medicine in ancient Greece, where you see the introduction of materialism with people like Thales, and eventually that gets into the techniques of people like Archimedes. I think what you're seeing there with the Greek rationalists is they're dissecting bodies, they're dissecting frogs, they're dissecting animals, they're dissecting plants, they're figuring them out. Aristotle, he's categorizing everything. Binomial nomenclature comes later down the line, but we can see its origins. And so everything is dissected. And so that, at the time, I'm sure the Greeks still buried people and, had their sacred rites, and Socrates, of course, was executed for atheism. So I'm not portraying a society which was wholly won over to neuroticism, but I'm showing the origins and the transitional forms that lead us to the point where we are today, where we now have a situation with social distancing where you can't touch people, and you have to wear this protective gear. And in many ways, that's symbolic of just the newest iteration of this mental shift away from charisma, away from the integrated personality, away from the holistic, organic view of life, where you follow your instincts, you follow your ancestors, you do what you want, when you want, how you want it, to this barrier we've set up between one another, which is about neuroticism, in which every physical interaction is a form of intrusion that we have to repress. We have to repress our sexuality. We have to repress our diet. We have to repress everything about ourselves. We have to repress our violent urges, right? If you thought this was simply a left-wing view, no, the left is full of repression. It just sort of compensates for the repression of violence by saying, oh, we'll be totally free with sexuality, fat acceptance movement, but they're very repressive of violence. They think violence is terrible, even if, you can show that violence is healthy and good, and people, especially young men, enjoy fighting and enjoy that sort of thing, and it's actually very good for you. I could point to various studies, or the kind of just physical exercise, the left is contemptuous of that very often. And when it isn't, it's often seemingly hypocritical and strange, right? Because we see the extreme tendencies and we see where these things lead if you pursue them far enough. And so it's not to, extol the virtues of the left wing and being free and liberated and castigate the right wing in an uneven or unbalanced way. But to be fair, everyone has repression. And so long as our instincts are not perfectly adapted to our ecology, the mimetics themselves, language itself, sort of necessitates a distancing from the thing. You have to kind of create distance between yourself and the thing. I guess this is what generative anthropology looks at in terms of the origins of language. There was a food source, and language was used. The ostensive was used to halt the advance toward the food, so it wouldn't become a melee. I mean, I don't know how useful that is, but it's there. It's there, right? Maybe a point of agreement. But yeah, this mimetics itself, language itself, the development of language is a kind of repression of intrusivity, of not merely acting as you would otherwise, but now this language is intruding into your ears. You can't help but perceive it. You can't help. When a baby learns language, the baby is subtly, I guess you could say it's an organic process. But when we are, or to give you another example that maybe ties this together, a lot of people believe that language developed out of song. And so when you think about that, song is stuck in my head, I can't get it out of my head. That's an example of the way that music and language, and I think language probably developed out of music, but music and language are intrusive. That is, we cannot help but perceive them and somehow integrate them into ourselves. And when we perceive these things, we feel uncomfortable if they're not in harmony with some other aspect of ourselves. So, I heard this Britney Spears song and it was really catchy and I hate it, but it's stuck in my head. Or, I wanted to do something, but then I was commanded to do something else. Or, I didn't want to, I don't want to be negative, but I'm listening to all this negative talk around me. I don't want to be negative, but all my friends and my family, they're constantly in a bad mood. They're constantly bringing me down. That's an example of mimetic intrusivity. And also with positivity as well. Let's say you want to be sad, you want to be depressed, you want to be, leave me alone, I don't want to be happy right now, I just want to be serious. And then you start hearing some happy music, or some people come up, they grab you by the shoulders, they give you a big hug, and they jostle you and they say, come on, man, you can't be unhappy forever. You could say there's a kinetic element there. You could say there's a genetic element to all of this, genetic receptivity. But it's another example of how we might want to be in a certain state, but the environment comes in and intrudes upon us, and we have this receptivity to our environment, which is not entirely controlled by our consciousness. That's what Buddhism tries to address, is say, well, we've got all these intrusive things in our environment that are constantly changing us, making us happy, making us sad. That's what causes suffering. So to avoid suffering, we have to halt the intrusive power of these events by reducing our receptivity to those events, and thus, become true neutral and become basically like like you're not even there. Things just sort of flow through you and you don't react, right? You're no longer the reactive personality. You're not a proactive personality. You're an emptiness, a divine tranquility, a peacefulness. And so the opposite of that is, I guess we could say, maybe to bring things together, we could say that there is a instinctual reactive personality which, sees the object of desire and goes for the object of desire. And that person can feel pain, obviously, but they don't necessarily feel suffering. I might even disagree with the Buddhists on this one, the idea that you have to let go of desire to avoid suffering. I think you can desire things, and you can feel pain when those things are taken away from you. You feel the pain of hunger, you feel the pain of physical violence. But suffering is something different. I think suffering is that squeamishness that the dog gets when he wants to eat the treat, but he knows he has to sit when the treat's on his nose and he can't eat it yet until he's told by his master, you go ahead and eat it. That squeamishness, I think that is the suffering, the distance of mimetics from the conflict between mimetics and genetics. I think that's where the suffering comes from. It's not in the state of complete instinctual reactivity, but it's this field of analysis that creates friction, that creates a feeling of constriction, a feeling like you're in a straitjacket. You can't be yourself. You can't express yourself. You're constantly fighting yourself. As a result, you feel guilt. You feel shame for these intrusive thoughts. For, you see something, you hear something, you perceive something, you think of something, you remember something. It makes you feel a certain way, and you are self-critical. And this gets to the point where it can become semi-unconscious, and to the point where you're not even aware of the way that you are thinking about and structuring your own thoughts, so that you get to the point where it's like you're just constantly engaging in this low-level sort of guerrilla warfare against yourself, where you're constantly just bringing yourself down, talking negatively about yourself in the narrative of your head. People who overanalyze a lot will do this. They'll constantly say, "Ah, man, I'm so stupid," and blah, blah, blah. And so this is a low-level guerrilla warfare, and people laugh it off and say, "Oh, that doesn't mean anything." But of course, everything means something. And so when we make these statements about ourselves, when we put ourselves down, that's one more, stick in the kindling, or whatever metaphor you want to use. That's just one more straw in the camel's back. And all of that can add up and lead to some pretty drastic results. The people who can't socialize, who can't be comfortable with themselves, who can't love with themselves, who feel no choice but to hate themselves, who feel no choice but to be in a constant state of constriction and completely unable to just be normal, to be relaxed, to take a deep breath, and and even the physical breathing is, of course, connected to the other levels of relaxation. But mentally, they can't allow themselves to relax. Mentally, they're always at war with themselves. And so while on the surface they might be calm, they might even be emotionless. That emotionlessness is a kind of paralysis, the inability to feel pain and feel anger and feel happiness and feel sadness. All of that has been numbed. All of that has been hemmed in. All of that has been walled up, and it's like a pressure cooker. And it doesn't necessarily need to burst in some kind of postal event or cataclysmic event. It can just sort of brew in there. But as it's brewing in that high pressure chamber, those steel walls make it impossible to then form human connections oftentimes. So it's an interesting phenomenon to look at, the phenomenon of intrusion and repression and receptivity, reactionary personality, the instinctual charisma, neuroticism, and all the effects, how you can identify it in people. Again, question of, are people predisposed to it genetically? Are you born that way? Did your parents make you that way? Was it society? Are we as a society hurtling toward this? Are current events relevant or related? What are the connections here? How does it all fit together? I guess that's a sort of a nature versus nurture debate that's sort of up in the air, and I don't think is necessarily the most important thing on an individual level. We can't, we can't necessarily. I suppose if you have a genetic narrative or 100% genetic narrative, it does make it a little bit difficult to try to address these issues if you're struggling with them, because then you have a sort of deterministic, fatalistic opinion about it. On the other hand, to have it say that anyone can change, people are infinitely plastic, usually produces some disappointing results and seems kind of unrealistic as well. So probably somewhere in the middle. But I think that's all I wanted to talk about. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.